Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. In the past 2 weeks, a little bit over than 2 weeks, we had talked about language. We had talked about various aspects of language, language comprehension, production, language acquisition, reading, aphasias, dyslexias, and so on and so forth. Before that, we talked about knowledge, we talked about concepts, and stuff. This is time now to move on to the third cognitive function that we will cover in this course. Now, I will talk in this week and in the next 2 lectures, 3 lectures about 2 very important cognitive functions that basically form a significant portion of why this course is referred to as higher cognitive processes. I am going to talk about reasoning and I am going to talk about decision making across the next 2 or 3 lectures. Now, life, if you see, it's really full of making decisions. Now, I am not really going to talk about perception, attention and memory now. Those are basic cognitive processes. Those are things that you need to deal with the world. Let us move a little bit towards the realm of thought and realm of thinking and deciding stuff. So, this whole point of life being full of decisions, you have sometimes simple decisions to make, like which flavor of the ice cream you want for your dinner, or harder decisions to make, that which person to marry or what kind of job to get in and those kind of things. Now, in addition to so this is basically a very important aspect of life. Making decisions is something very important that we tend to do. How do we come up with these decisions? A lot of times our decisions are preceded by some sort of thinking, some sort of reasoning. We will talk about reasoning also in this course, but what is reasoning? Reasoning is basically the process of drawing conclusions. So you draw conclusions from sometimes from whatever is there in front of you, whatever evidence is there in front of you, whatever your past knowledge is, whatever the current scenario is telling you, and you kind of process those kind of those things, and you come up, you do a churning up, you do a reasoning, and on the basis of that reasoning, you kind of can make decisions. So in this week, basically, or in the next 2 or 3 lectures, basically we will talk about aspects of decision making and we will talk about aspects of reasoning, and we will try and see that how are these processes accomplished by us. The cognitive by which people start with a particular kind of information and they come to a certain kind of conclusions is referred to as reasoning. So, if I were to define reasoning, is basically when you take up some given information and you arrive at a particular conclusion, whatever technique or whatever strategy you use at arriving that conclusion is basically what reasoning is about. So, we will talk about reasoning today a little bit. Now, reasoning is obviously it's involved in so many arenas of life, and also sometimes that even when you don't really have to make a decision, even when you don't have to come up with a particular choice, you are still performing some kind of reasoning or the other. Reasoning is a very important aspect of your thought processes. So, there are 2 kinds of reasoning that you might be engaged in at different points in time. The first one is referred to as deductive reasoning. What happens in deductive reasoning is that it involves a sequence of statements. Let us call it syllogism for jargon's sake. You have certain kinds of statements, and basically you compare those statements and then you come to a third part, which is a conclusion. So, the 2 statements could be, suppose for example, I tell you that a C is needed, a C is absolutely necessary to get a course X. Okay, and then you come across a person that Rakesh has got the course X. So, it definitely it's automatically you will conclude that Rakesh must have got either a C or some above grade, that is why he has got the course X. So, automatically, almost involuntarily, you will come up with this kind of reasoning. This is what deductive reasoning is about, and the conclusions you come up generally are definitive conclusions. On the other hand, sometimes you could basically be faced with scenarios where you don't really have a definitive conclusion to make. Sometimes you could you try to arrive at conclusions based on probably true evidence. You know something, you've heard something, you're not 100% sure, but on the basis of whatever you know, you start making a conclusion. And again, because the nature of evidence is not definite, the nature of the conclusion is also probable. So, this kind of reasoning is referred to as inductive reasoning, and it's a bit more free, it's a bit more flexible, and obviously, but it's not definite. So we will talk about how these two reasonings work. Let's talk a little bit about deductive reasoning first. Aristotle introduced the basic forms of deductive reasoning called syllogisms. Syllogisms are statements. Syllogism basically includes at least two statements which are referred to as premises and followed by a third statement which is called a conclusion. So there are two premises and there is one conclusion. So let us consider a categorical syllogism. A categorical syllogism is basically in which the premises and conclusions describe the relationship between two kinds of categories, and these categorical syllogisms basically include words like all, none or same, something like that. So the first syllogism is again borrowing from Goldstein's book. The premise is all birds are animals, all animals eat food is the second premise. So on the basis of these two premises you come up with the conclusion that therefore all birds eat food. This is a categorical syllogism. Now categorical syllogisms might or might not always be correct. In the sense, if you have to evaluate how good or bad a syllogism is, you might want to look at its validity. What is validity? A syllogism is valid when its conclusion is following logically from the two premises. Okay. So when it is fitting the logical operation, I will give you an example. The example is all birds are animals. Okay. All animals have four legs is the second one, and then the conclusion is all birds have four legs. Now if you look at this syllogism here, the third statement, the conclusion, follows logically from the first two. So the conclusion is following logically from the two premises. However, just read it once again. All birds are animals, or animals have four legs, all birds have four legs. Now you know for a fact that all birds do not have four legs. So now how is this possible? It's possible because the idea is that even though the form of the two premises is correct, and basically if you see the conclusion follows the form of the two premises almost completely, the whole point is that even though the conclusion is valid and is logically following from the premises, truth is a different thing. Truth is not only whether the syllogism is valid or not. When validity in that sense depends upon the form of the syllogism, and which determines whether the conclusion follows logically from the two premises. However, truth on the other hand refers to the content of this premises. So it will also take into account what is the content actually saying, which have to be also evaluated to determine whether they are consistent with facts. So logically the third statement follows from the two. You see all A are B, all B are C, by law of association all A are C, this is all very good. But if you look at the content, you would know that obviously all A are C is not correct in this case. So you have to evaluate the content of the syllogism at hand. So one of the things we know now that there is a difference between validity and truth. So the difference between validity and truth sometimes, however, can make it difficult to judge whether the reasoning that somebody is applied is logical or not. Not only can valid syllogisms lead to false conclusions, but also syllogisms can be invalid though each of the premises and the conclusion still seem reasonable. For example, all students are tired, some tired people are irritable, some of the students are irritable. Now you don't really, logically it is okay. You can actually, because it's not an all or none kind of statement, you can probably correctly derive some of the students are irritable from the above two premises, but again it's not really correct in some sense, because even though the premises and the conclusions are true, still the conclusion is not really logically following from the two premises. So there has to be some procedure for determining the validity or lack of validity, and these procedures are slightly more difficult. I'll probably not really get into it because this is better handled by a philosophy class and in a course on logic, but I'll just give you the main message, and the main message is that good reasoning and truth are not really the same thing. Sometimes with good reasoning, very rationally you can come up with something, but that conclusion might not be a true conclusion. So these two things, a lot of times I think people confuse good reasoning with truth, but truth and good reasoning are slightly different things. Let us show this from this example. Now I'm just putting a real world example here, again borrowed from Goldstein's book. Listen to me, I know for a fact that all members of the Congress from New York are against the new tax law. I also know for a fact that some members of the Congress who are against the new tax law are taking money from special interest groups. So, what this means as far as I can tell is that some of the members of the Congress from New York are taking money from special interest groups. Now, just examine this a little bit more closely. This earlier argument that I was just giving is very similar to the third syllogism that we were talking about. And as with the third syllogism, it does not really logically follow that because all members from New York are against the new tax law and some members of the Congress are taking money from that are against the new tax law or taking money from special interest groups, you cannot still conclude that some members of the Congress of New York are taking money from the special interest groups. It just does not really follow, because those some in the second and third statements might not really overlap with each other. So, even though the syllogisms may sometimes seem academic and people often you will find people often using syllogisms to prove their points, they sometimes do not realize, and people do not realize that its reasoning might be invalid. Okay. You can actually see it a lot in the way newspapers operate, a lot of media operates, and a lot of people around us operate, and again this should basically help you solve some of those things. Let us move to a different kind of syllogisms for a while. So, there are conditional syllogisms. Conditional syllogisms have two premises and they have a conclusion, like the ones we have been discussing, but here the first premise basically begins with the form if. Okay. And this kind of deductive reasoning is basically very common in our everyday life. Suppose, for example, your friend comes to you, Steve comes to you and asks for $20. Again, I am using an American example here. Suppose you have a friend called Steve and he comes to you asking for $20, but you have known Steve for some time now, and you know that if I give him $20, then he is not going to give me back. So, if I try and put this in a form of a syllogism, I can say if I lend $20 to Steve, then I will not get it back. I lend Steve $20, I am not getting back my $20. So, this is the conditional syllogism. Now, conditional syllogisms are of 4 types, and I am just talking about them right now. So, affirming the antecedent. Suppose I studied, therefore I get a good grade. So, my getting a good grade affirms the fact that I studied. Then there is denying the consequent. I did not get a good grade, therefore I did not study. So, basically the idea is that I did not get a good grade is kind of denying the fact that I did not study. Then there is affirming the consequent. I got a good grade, therefore I must have studied. This is again something. Then there is denying the antecedent. I did not study, therefore I did not get a good grade. So, it is kind of basically denying the first part. Now, you can see here that there is this validity judgments here, and only the top 2 were judged as valid, the bottom 2 were judged as invalid, and 97% of people could judge the first syllogism, 60% people could judge the second syllogism, but a lot of people, only 40% of people could judge the third and the fourth syllogisms correctly. Now, what is happening here? Syllogism 1 is called affirming the antecedent, because antecedent P, if I study, is affirmed in the second premise that I studied, that I get a good grade. The conclusion is therefore valid. Syllogism 2 is called denying the consequent, because consequent Q, I will get a good grade, is negated in the second premise, I did not get a good grade. The conclusion of this syllogism is again valid, because I did not study, because I did not get a good grade, I must not have studied. Syllogism 3 is called affirming the consequent. So, what is happening here is because Q, that is the consequent, so the form is if P then Q, the consequent Q is affirmed in the second premise. So, I got a good grade. Now, the conclusion of the syllogism, I studied, is invalid, because even if you did not study, it is still possible that you might have got a good grade. So, again this one is therefore not valid. Now, perhaps the exam was easier, maybe you know the material because you are familiar with it, you had practiced something, you might not have studied and still got a good grade. It's like, for example, if it's a robin, then it's a bird. It's a bird, therefore it's a robin is not correct, because if it's a bird, it could be some other bird as well. But if it's a robin, certainly it must be a bird. This is the kind of comparison you got to make. Talking about syllogism 4. Syllogism 4 is called denying the antecedent. So, it has to negate P, okay, because and P has to be negated in the second premise. So, the conclusion of the syllogism, I did not get a good grade, is also not valid, because as in syllogism 3, the last one can probably think of a situation that would contradict the conclusion. You studied very hard, but you still did not get a good grade, okay, or a good grade was got even by a person who did not really study so much. So, again I will give you a simpler example. If it's a robin, then it's a bird, it's not a robin, therefore it's not a bird. No, it could be some other bird and not a robin. So, it's there because it's not a robin, therefore it's not a bird, does not really follow. So, this is again how the conditional syllogisms work. So, because we are talking about conditional syllogisms, it only fits that we start talking a little bit about conditional reasoning. Okay, what is conditional reasoning? Now, if reasoning from conditional syllogisms depended only upon applying the rules of formal logic, the ones which we were talking about, does the conclusion follow from the premise, that kind of thing, then it would not really matter whether the syllogism was stated in terms of abstract symbols such as P and Q, or in terms of real examples. So, I could always say if P then Q, and if Q then P, something like that. It did not matter that I am talking about if it is a robin then it is a bird, or if it is not a bird then it is not robin, those kind of things. It would not really matter if it were just following logical notations. So, research shows that people are often better at judging the validity of syllogisms when real world examples are used, as opposed to when P and Q and these kind of if P then Q kind of statements are used. Let us take an example. So, there is this very famous Watson's card sorting test. So, what happened was each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other, and the task is to indicate which cards you would need to turn over to test the following rule, and the rule is if there is a vowel on one side, then there is an even number on the other side. Now, the idea is you have to really check that if there is a, you have to really check which is the card that you will turn over to check this rule consistently. So, these things are E, K, 4 and 7, what do you really need to check? Okay. So, I think here there are at least two things that you can check. You can either check E because it is a vowel, if there is no even number on the other side there will be a problem, or you could just check 4, that because if it is 4 here, then there should be an even number on that. Let's check what happens. When Watson 1966 posed this task to people, 53% of his participants indicated that E must be turned over. This is correct because turning E over would directly test the rule. So, if there is not an even number on the other side, the rule is falsified and the rule is broken. So, if there is an E, then there must be an even number. So, there is an odd number. If there is an odd number on the other side, it kind of does the rule. However, another card also needs to be turned over to fully test the rule. Which one? 4. 46% of the participants suggested that 4 would also need to be turned over. Now, the problem here is that if a vowel is on the other side of the card, this is consistent with the rule. But if a consonant is on the other side, turning 4 will not be able to tell us anything. So, I was kind of trying to lead you astray here. If you turn 4 and if there is a consonant on the other side, the rule does not really tell you whether that there is no consonant on the even number. It just tells you if there is a E, if there is a vowel, then the other side should be even number. So, as shown in figure, only 4% of Watson's participants came up with the correct answer, that the second card that needs to be turned over is 7. Turning over 7 is important because revealing a vowel would disconfirm the rule. Once you turn 7, if you see a vowel there, then the rule is broken and the rule is test. So, what we are actually looking for here is the falsification principle. What we are trying to do is we have to find one instance at least that falsifies the rule. So, if you want to test a particular rule, it is necessary to look for situations that would falsify the rule rather than confirm the rule or tell us nothing about the rule. Here is the different kind of scenarios that are there, again borrowed from Goldstein's book, and they say there are only two conditions that will test whether the rule is getting falsified. If you turn over E and find odd, or if you turn 7 and find a vowel. So, this is one of the ways how conditional reasoning would work. Moving on, you saw that people are in some sense following these rule kind of things. So, if you talk about regulations, so the Watson task basically had generated a great deal of research, and one reason for the degree of interest is that it is a conditional reasoning task and people were interested in knowing about different aspects of conditional reasoning. So, researchers basically they wanted to determine if there are general mechanisms that are responsible for improved performance in real world terms, if conditional reasoning works better with real examples. One such version of the Watson's card problem is the beer drinking age version. So, I will just show you the problem now. So, the idea is, the rule is, if drinking beer you must be over 19 years old. Now, there are 2 age cards and 2 drink cards. So, there is a beer card, there is a soda card, there is a 16-year-old card and a 24-year-old card. Now you have to check which is the easier thing. You will see that a lot of people easily detected that beer card must be turned over, or the 16 card probably must be turned over. Let us see. The beer drinking age version of the problem is basically identical to the problem that except that concrete everyday terms are substituted for the letters and numbers. The task we were talking EK47, we have actual things here. Now Griggs and Cox used the version of this task and found that 73% of the participants provided the correct response. It is necessary to turn the beer card and the 16-year cards, both of which check for the falsification of the rule. In contrast, none of the participants answered the abstract problem correctly. The same EK47 problem was given to these people, none of them could actually answer that correctly. Apparently, relating the beer or drinking age problem to actual regulations helps people, because there is an actual regulation which restricts alcohol drinking in these particular countries. So probably what they were doing is they were relating this actual regulation with the conditional rule here, and that is why they were able to solve this problem better using the real world example, even though they could not solve the abstract example. So here is the finding. So you see, none of the people could actually solve the problem with the abstract rules, but a good 73% of the people could solve the beer age drinking problem. Now taking this task slightly further, Cheng and Holyoke, they took the Watson task a little bit further, and they basically proposed the concept of pragmatic reasoning. So the idea is that the way of thinking about cause and effect in the world is learned as a part of experiencing everyday life. So how you go about your life in the world, how you observe events around you, how you see that things are happening in the world around you. That is basically going to give you an aspect of what is called pragmatic reasoning, what really happens in the world. Okay, so your reasoning is not really based on hard logic, if x then y. It is basically based upon knowledge of whether really y happens if x is there. Things about, suppose for example, there will be a fine if you are not wearing a helmet. Now somebody would know that it's also sometimes there that even if you are not wearing a helmet, you might get away without giving a fine. So this is basically they kind of adapted this Watson's card sorting problem to a different thing, and they came up with what is called a permission schema. What is a permission schema? Permission schema is a rule that states that if a person satisfies condition A, then he or she gets to carry out the condition B. Okay, if age this much, then drinking is allowed, something like that. The permission schema that if you are 19, then you get to drink beer was learned by everybody through experience, so they were able to apply that to the card task. That is how the link is being made. Apparently, activating the permission schema helps people focus attention on the card that would test the schema. So they would automatically go to scenarios that would basically test and falsify the schema, because this is a real world problem. Participants' attention is automatically attracted to the 16-year-old card because they know that beer on the other side would be violating the rule. To test this idea that a permission schema may be involved in reasoning about the card task, Cheng and Holyoke again ran an experiment with two groups of participants. We will see what kind of cards they were presented with. One of the groups read the following instructions. So the cards are entering, transient, cholera, typhoid, hepatitis, typhoid and hepatitis. So 3 diseases, 2 diseases in entering or transient, and the rule is if entering, then cholera is listed. So basically, and the instruction is, this is the scenario, the instruction is you are an immigration officer at the international airport in Manila, that is the capital of Philippines. Among the documents you to check is a form called H. One side of this form indicates whether the passenger is entering the country or is in transit, and the other form lists the names of tropical diseases. You have to make sure that if the form says entering on one side, the other side includes cholera among the list of diseases. Which of the following forms would you have to turn over to check? Now again, these are cards or forms, and you have to turn over to check whether somebody is entering or is in transit. Now it's very easy here, because this is a pragmatic task, to just check either the entering card or the cholera, typhoid, hepatitis card. 62% of these participants in this group chose the correct cards, entering and typhoid hepatitis. Entering, other side cholera must have been listed, typhoid hepatitis, then entering should not be there. Participants in the other group saw the same cards, there is another group, and heard the same instructions as the first group, but with the following changes. So there were some more instructions put in. instead of saying that the form listed tropical diseases, the instructions said that the form listed inoculations that the traveler had received in the past 6 months. So, some kind of vaccinations must have been received. In addition, the following sentence were added. This is to ensure that entering passengers are protected against the disease. So, this is again some more information is added. The changes in these instructions were calculated to achieve a very important effect. What was that? Instead of checking just to see whether the correct diseases are listed on the form, the immigration officer is now checking to see whether the travelers have the inoculations necessary to give him permission to enter the country. These instructions were intended to activate the participants' permission schema, and to apparently it was found that this works, because 91% of the participants, as opposed to 62% earlier, participated in this condition and they picked up the right cards. So, you see how invoking the real world example, how invoking the pragmatic reasoning or the permission schema concept is helping people to do reasoning much more easily as compared to the abstract reasoning things. So, this is the results of the Cheng and Holyoake's 1985 experiment. Now, people have also thought about an evolutionary approach towards solving this 4-card problem. The alternative to the earlier possibility that we were talking about is the fact that performance on the Wesen card sorting problem is governed by what is called a built-in cognitive program that kind of detects cheating, that kind of detects every time you are going to violate a particular rule. So, Cosmides and Tooley, they are one of the two evolutionary psychologists who have an evolutionary perspective on cognition. They basically argue that we can trace many of the properties of our minds back to the evolutionary principles of natural selection. Only those things would have survived, only those things would have stayed on with us across centuries that would have helped us to survive and propagate and come to the next generation. So, according to natural selection, adaptive characteristics like will over time, adaptive characteristics will over time become basic characteristics of humans, because these things have survived generations and generations. These things will become almost embedded in our psyches. So, they try to apply this idea. So, if you apply this idea to cognition, it follows that a highly adaptive feature of the mind would, through an evolutionary process, become a very basic characteristic of the mind. So, anything that we have now should have been useful for us to survive through the ages. Let us take an example. An example is the social exchange theory. Now, the social exchange theory says that an important aspect of human behavior is the ability for two people to cooperate with each other in such a way that is beneficial to both of the people. If only one of them is getting benefited, then it is not evolutionarily very useful. One of them will die out, and the other, and as soon as they realize that I am losing in this bargain, they will stop cooperating. So, for cooperation to exist, there should be benefit to both parties. So, evolutionary approach proposes that the Wesen card sorting problem can be understood in terms of cheating. Thus, people do well in the cholera task because they can detect someone who cheats the country by entering without a cholera shot. That is probably what is helping, and not the permission schema. So, let us see. They wanted to test this idea. So, Cosmides and Tooley, what they did was they devised a number of 4-card scenarios involving unfamiliar situations. Now, no real world problems, but unfamiliar situations, not the abstract ones, unfamiliar situations which they would not know of, but seeming like real world problems. So, what they did was they basically came up with a hypothetical culture called Kulvane, and they said participants in these experiments were told to read a story about that culture, which led to the statement that if a man eats a cassava root, then he must have a tattoo in his face. This is the rule. Participants were seeing 4 cards: eats cassava roots, eats molar nuts, has a tattoo, does not have a tattoo. Now, they were asked to test this, and the task was to determine whether the conditional statement was being adhered to, whether it was being followed or not. Now, this is a situation which is completely unfamiliar to the participants. You compare it with the beer and age drinking problem, or you compare with the immigration problem. This condition, because it is hypothetical, is not really known to these people earlier. Okay, so Cosmides and Tooley, however, found that participants' performance was very high on this task, even though the rule was completely unfamiliar. They also ran experiments in which participants did better for statements that involved cheating than for other statements that could not be interpreted in a cheating. So, in a cheating sort of a manner, they kind of manipulated how much the rule was being was violated. If it was being violated, that amounted to cheating, versus if it was being manipulated, that did not really amount to a lot of cheating. So, this is basically what they kind of find from here is that maybe this kind of reasoning, detecting the violation of a rule which is not really beneficial to both parties, can lead to particular problems. So we saw here that reasoning basically works in a way that is evolutionally also very significant, and it follows particular characteristics. Also, reasoning works much better in real world scenarios as compared to abstract scenarios. This is all from me on reasoning. We will continue with the next lecture and we talk about decision making.